I've just finished my first complete playthrough of Final Fantasy on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Let's talk about it. So I have some experience playing the remakes on PlayStation and Game Boy Advance, and an hour or two on the 20th anniversary PSP release of Final Fantasy. I've never completed any of those remakes, but I got really close on the Game Boy and PlayStation remakes. This was a really different experience. For a little bit of history, Final Fantasy was first released in North America in 1990, and it's largely unchanged from its Japanese version. There are some changes, like the eye is a beholder in the Japanese release. And because of character limitations, things like Flare were renamed to Nuke, Thunder became Lightning, and due to Nintendo of North America's censorship policies, any Judeo-Christian imagery was changed in the North American release. And since its initial release on the MSX2 computer in Japan, it has since been released on the Famicom/NES, the WonderSwan Color, which we here in North America never got to see, the PlayStation, the Game Boy Advance, a mobile port written in Java that I haven't found any more information other than this happened. Then you got the 20th anniversary PSP release, and finally the iPhone/Android release. If you wish to experience this game, you've got so many options. So I'm going to go over my experience with the NES release, and hopefully that'll give you insight into if you should bother playing Final Fantasy, specifically this version. So gameplay. Alright, strike that. Take two. This can be a rough game. The mechanics and systems aren't difficult to understand by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, the mechanics can be fun in a lot of ways. And it was a real treat to see where a lot of the tropes and commonalities between the Final Fantasy games got their origin. After all, in this very first game, you meet Bahamut, who becomes a mainstay of every Final Fantasy I've played. But there are some major issues with the gameplay. For example, the intelligence stat is broken. This means that any party member who can cast a spell is going to do just as good with it as any other member of the party that can cast a spell. So when your fighters get their class changed into, I believe, warriors or something like that, and they can use, level 1, 2, and 3 spells, they're going to cast those spells just as well as your wizards, who are supposed to be badass magic users. Also, most of the weapons that are supposed to have special effects don't work. For my favorite example, the Dragon Sword, which is supposed to inflict extra damage on dragons and dragon-like creatures, it doesn't. There's just no extra damage. And this is a bummer because when you pick up what are supposed to be awesome weapons for an upcoming fight, or like when you pick up the Dragon Sword, you're running into a lot of dragons in your random encounters. It's no better than what you already have, and in my case, it was worse than what I already had for both of my fighters. Then you've got broken magic spells. Spells like Temper, Saber, and Expert don't work at all. Then there's spells like Lock 2, which do the exact opposite of what they're supposed to do. Lock 2 is supposed to decrease enemy evade by 20%. Instead, it raises it by 20%. That's more than broken. All these glitches can be worked around and ignored, and the game is still a lot of fun to play. Just be warned that Final Fantasy is all about the grind. You'll be working for each level and piece of gold. It's not until very late in the game that gold is no longer a concern. During my playthrough, I was constantly depleting my funds to buy full stacks of 99 heals. I bought those stacks of heals because your magic use is very limited, so I wanted to save all my magic for big boss fights. Every Final Fantasy game puts a limit on your magic use. I don't think I've ever seen one where you have unlimited use of your magic spells. But in Final Fantasy, because they intended magic to be the end-all be-all, that's not right. They intended it to be super strong and useful all throughout the game. It's extremely limited, and it's not just by mana points or MP. You have daily uses, and at max level, your wizards can only use each spell 9 times between rests. That really requires you to plan your uses for those spells. During my playthrough, I found that getting to the dungeon bosses and the fiends was much harder than actually fighting them. A big reason behind this is that there are so many random encounter creatures that can cause just devastating status effect changes. I'm not talking about poison. Poison can be easily remedied and worked around. The one that got me really hard is what I called getting stun locked. And this is where your entire party becomes paralyzed, which sounds like a far stretch, but it's not at all, because any undead creature can cause paralysis with a regular melee hit. It's not something special they have to do. So, when it's your 4 light warriors versus 9 undead creatures, you can get every party member paralyzed, and then before they can cure themselves of paralysis, they get re-paralyzed. I once spent half an hour watching my party get hacked to death by low-level ghouls because I was hoping that 1 or 2 of them would cure themselves of paralysis and then I could run away or do something about these 9 ghouls. But it never happened. I just kept getting re-paralyzed and then I watched my party wipe. That is just such an infuriating experience, and it makes the game a lot harder than it really is, I guess I could say, because the rest of the game didn't feel that hard. But when that happened to me, I almost wanted to give up the game. It's just so frustrating. Final Fantasy is a very story-like game. You start off dropped in the middle of nowhere with no direction, no gear, and no spells. But you do start off with 400 gold, which is enough to get most party configurations decently outfitted for the beginning of the game. Then you learn that the local princess has been kidnapped, if you ask the right person. So you go save her from Garland, who's easier to fight than it is to walk to his hideout. And this is where the journey really begins. Like literally, this is where you get the opening credits and the title card. Before you cross that bridge, make sure you get the loot from the princess, because she's not going to just offer it, and you will need it for the end of the game. Little side note tangent here. It is completely possible to get stuck in the final dungeon of the game and have to restart your game completely over because you didn't get this loot from the princess. So if you decide to play, watch out for that. Then you go up north, you fight BK's men, you get the boat. Let me just confer with my notes here. Then you save the elf prince from Astos' curse by getting the herb from Matoya, by giving her the crystal eye from Astos after getting the MacGuffin crown from the marsh cave. Get the TNT, give it to the dwarves, eat the vampire in the earth cave, feed the ruby to the titan. Then you go see the sage, get the staff from him, go back to the earth cave and beat up the earth fiend. You're a quarter of the way done. Now you can get the canoe, beat the fire fiend, get the floater, so you can get the airship. Beat the water fiend after a ridiculously dumb fetch quest, which required me to buy a fairy in a bottle. I didn't know there was a fairy in it when I bought the bottle. And release it at a specific place in the world on the other side of the world. And there's no clues as to how any of this process goes. Yeah, maybe there's clues, but that's a pretty wide interpretation of what a clue is. So once you beat the water fiend, you get the cube from the waterfall. Again, no clues. Then you go learn Lifish, no clues on how to do that. Then you go to Lythen, you get the chime, no clues. To get into the Mirage Tower, at the top of the Mirage Tower, you use the cube to go to the Sky Shrine. Sky Shrine is pretty cool. It's one of my visually favorite places in the game. My one complaint with it is that there are sections in the Sky Shrine where the encounter rate is just redonkulous. After you beat the Sky Fiend, if you've talked to the right people, you learn that the center of the world is gathering energies and you need to go there. Center of the world turns out to be the first dungeon you went into where you fought Garland. You go there, the orbs shatter the dark orb that was there in the background the whole time and you never paid attention to, and then you travel back in time 2,000 years. If you plan on playing this game, make sure someone in your party has the exit spell and someone else has the warp spell. In my case, that was my white wizard and my black wizard. Easy. So now that you're 2,000 years back in time, you find your way through the Temple of Fiends. You fight the 4 fiends again. This time, no opportunity to heal in between. And at the end of that, you find Garland again. Only now, thanks to the time loop that's been set up, Garland is actually chaos. You beat chaos easier than you think you should. And then, go make yourself a sandwich and a cup of coffee or a cup of tea. because the end credit sequence is the longest sequence I remember from any game I've played recently. Overall, I enjoyed playing Final Fantasy. It's not the most engaging game, but things like being able to make whatever party mix you want really adds a lot of replay value to this game. And once you know the sequence of events for the story, which isn't hard once you've done it, it really presents you with a fairly open world that lets you play around and just try and break things or play with them. And the open world that you get once you've given the dwarves the TNT is really impressive for a game that was released in 1987 or an 8-bit computer. Now there had been open worlds before that, but none that are as visually impressive. And this is where I inject a little bit about me into this review of the game to help explain why I think it's a fun game. So for a number of years I played in a Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition campaign. And the magic system feels very familiar. I played a magic user when I played Dungeons & Dragons. And the campaign feels very much like a campaign I would have tried as I was learning to be a DM. You know, it's got a very classic feel to it, especially if you've played other Final Fantasies. And sure, it's quaint and not as big and involved as later releases, but I think that's part of the charm of this game. You're not holding too much in your head about these characters. In fact, these characters, they only have as much as you put into them. There's no backstory to the Warriors of Light. They're just there. That can be refreshing in a time where every new game I pick up requires me to know 15, 20 years of history for any kind of franchise that I'm playing. But with Final Fantasy, this is all you need to know is what's in this cartridge. Now, with that said, I will say if you plan on playing yourself, you should consider getting a walkthrough or a guide, because there are going to be times where you're stuck. And if you have a copy like mine, where all I have is the cartridge, I don't have the fold-out map, I don't have the detailed instruction booklet that originally came with this game, you're gonna need that extra information. Without guides that I found online, I would not have finished the campaign. The fetch quest to get into the water shrine, I don't think I would have figured out on my own, because I would have given up before I did. Overall, I do recommend the game. If you have an inkling to play it, I do suggest you go and you play one of the remakes, specifically the Game Boy Advance remake. And I say that because Game Boy Advances are easier to find than an NES. Sure, there are lots of NES clones out there, you could pick that up, but the Game Boy Advance game is also easier and cheaper to find than the NES. And I'm only talking $5 for the price, but you can find the Game Boy Advance game all over the place online, and I've seen several copies of it at local game stores from me. So there's the conclusion. Play it if you want. If you don't want to bother with broken magic systems and, well, just broken mechanics in general, play the Game Boy Advance remake. It's a ton of fun, and it's a great pick up and put down game overall. If you like my review, please like, comment, subscribe. I am going to be whoring myself out at the end of every video, but I am also genuinely interested in your thoughts. Have you played Final Fantasy, and what are your thoughts on it? Do you think it's worth playing now in the modern age? Over and out, watch your six.